Where we've been in this message series called Rhythms. The concept of rhythms is that we have spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines that they enable us to grow closer to the Lord. Their design isn't to be a taskmaster over us, meaning like if we forget to read our Bible one day, it's not supposed to have this overbearing sense of guilt that weighs on our shoulders, but instead we know, and as we practice disciplines such as reading our Bible 15 minutes a day every day, or praying 15 minutes a day every day, or as we practice disciplines such as fasting, that we will be encouraged towards the Lord, that our souls, our spirits, our minds, that our whole self will be more sensitive to the Lord and His Spirit. So that's what this concept of rhythms is about. So the first week we talked through Bible reading, and if you were here, if you remember the verse, if you would say it out loud with me, I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. And this was where we talked about having a goal of reading and praying 15 minutes a day, and understanding that it's a goal, it's something to shoot for, to work towards, but we're not going to be overlaid with guilt if we miss a day. But we're going to hide the Lord's word in our hearts so that we would not sin against Him, that we would be more aligned with Him. And then we moved on the second week to begin talking about fasting. And we're talking about feasting today, but we talked about fasting a few weeks ago. And if you remember the verse, say it with me. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so we talked about fasting, and then we moved into Sabbath, or we moved into resting. We talked about just as we refrain from food, so also do we need to learn how to refrain from work. We need to learn how to refrain or stop or press pause on the things that we do, the tasks, the different demands, all of the busyness. And we also need to rest in that. And the verse from that week is Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. So if you would say that with me. Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. And then last week we talked about sharing family responsibility. The verse for that was Jesus said this, my mother and brother are those who do the will of my Father in heaven. That one's just not as easy. Like, it doesn't have a good rhythm for memorization as easy as the other ones. But let's try this out loud together. Jesus said, my mother and my brother are those who do the will of my Father in heaven. And so we talked about the concept of sharing family responsibility. We talked about what that looks like in a church. And I also shared how I can't tell you exactly what that looks like for you as we share the family responsibility that we have in the family of God, and what that looks like in our workplaces, what that looks like in our homes, what that looks like for us, each as individuals in our world. By the way, I think in 2 weeks, trying to bribe everyone with pizza, but we talked about being guest speakers back in the kids ministry, and what that's going to look like is being the rock star for about 15 to 20 minutes. So you'll be able to be in here with us for worship and for prayer, and then after the worship and prayer time, you're going to just, make an appearance, right? As all guest speakers do, they just show up. And all the kids are going to love you, and they're going to go crazy, and you'll be able to share about a 15 to 20 minute message. And if you want, at that point, you can come right on back out here, and you can just exit with all the fame. And that's one way that we're going to begin sharing your family responsibility. So again, if you could stick around after worship 2 weeks from now, just to get a little bit more details, if you're willing to do that. And then also we talked through things like sound and computer. So thank you, Brian and Ken, this week for running that. And that's some of the things that it looks like in our church. And so now we finally get to feasting, right? I bet you if we came up with a list of spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines, my guess would be feasting would not be high on the list if we would even include it on the list at all. Right? When we think of things that are designed to grow us closer to God, to create communion, feasting generally doesn't rise to the top of our minds as something that would be a spiritual practice to be intentional about. Right? We know that we should talk about fasting, but do we really need to talk about feasting? I mean, if we just even go through the different days or holidays, so we have Christmas and Easter dinner, of course, and then we have 4th of July barbecues, and we have Memorial Day, and then we have Valentine's Day, where we might go out for dinner. And I'm sure there's many more holidays. I just can't think of any right now. There's many more occasions for food. Birthdays would be another one. Birthday celebrations, various different things. What's that? Is it John? Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. Yes. So, I've shared this before. I shared it in the fasting message that I love food, probably a little too much, right? Probably a little too much. And so I want you guys just to indulge me for, I think it's about 1 minute and 30 seconds. But I want to show you in picture or in film the mental war that goes on in my head when I'm at like a really good buffet, like Golden Corral. As I'm trying to get up to the buffet and I'm trying to get the food that I'm looking for, and I'm trying to like dodge everyone else. Again, I love food a little bit too much, but let's just take 1 minute and 30 seconds if you'd indulge me and see what goes on in my brain. So again, that's what goes on in my mind as I'm working my way up to the buffet line, cutting the knees out of one person, I love food probably a little too much. I also love the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So Michelangelo is my favorite, just for the record, in case anybody was wondering. All right, so where are we going with this? Where are we going with this message? The verse for today is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So if you have Bibles or if you want to open up on your phone, we're going to get there, but you'll want to just open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But the verse is this: so whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. If we can, let's say that together. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And so when it comes to eating, when it comes to feasting, how do we begin to do it for the glory of God? So when we think of feasting, when we think of Sabbath, when we think of rest, eating good meals is generally included in that. When we think of having a good time or relaxing away from work, generally we think of food as also being present. Not every time, but by and large, that's part of what we think of when we're resting or when we're having Sabbath. When we're not working, right? We're eating. Or we're engaged in recreation and so forth, but we see that when we're eating, we're specifically not working, right? When we're eating, we're specifically not working. But unfortunately, as Americans, we figured out how to fail at that one as well, right? Like, I remember when I was driving to Drumline, so I would get up very early on Fridays, and I would have to leave and take a 2 or 3 hour drive, usually to Detroit or Columbus. Sometimes I'd drive to Indianapolis on Friday morning, and then we would have drumline rehearsal from Friday night through Sunday evening, and then I would make the drive back home Sunday evening, be ready for work. And I had a habit, and that habit was this: during my drive, because I didn't have meal times, I would stop at McDonald's and get about 5 double cheeseburgers to be my companions along the way. I don't know how I did it. I was younger, number one. I was much younger, number one. I was exercising like crazy. But we've figured out a way in our culture to skip meals or to just become so busy that we don't even pause to enjoy feasting. That we don't take time to enjoy eating with other people. And what does this have to do? What does it lead us towards? I want to read a verse that's going to be on the screen. This is Colossians 2:16 and 17. So don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days or new moon ceremonies or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come, and Christ himself is that reality. Christ himself is that reality. So how does this fit? We've been talking about taking Sabbath and making that a practice of our lives. And absolutely, it's not a rule that we have to follow. It is a good practice and a good rhythm to have in our lives. But when it comes to food, when we gather around the table, hopefully with other people, we enjoy one another's company. And also, hopefully, what we should be doing is enjoying the good gifts that God has given us. In the beginning, the Lord created the heavens and the earth and everything that was in it. As we go on through the creation story in the book of Genesis, we'll see that the Lord created every fruit-bearing tree and every fruit with seeds in it that they could reproduce, and the vegetation of the ground, and that the Lord gave these gifts to us for food. When we're eating, we're partaking of the good gifts that God has given us, but also we should be communing with people and with God, with one another and with the Lord, very similar to the Sabbath rest. And so we talked about favorite foods, and a lot of you know this. I don't normally eat bacon. Yeah, I know, right? It's not a normal thing. Ham's not high on the list. Pork chops are okay. Ribs, if they're done right. So I eat pepperoni. I eat pig, right? So it's not I don't eat pig thing. It's just bacon's not high on my food list of things that I like really enjoy to eat. Just for me, it doesn't make it. But when it comes to bacon, let's read what the scriptures say about people who say you can't eat bacon, right? This is found in 1 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 5. They will say it is wrong to be married, and it's wrong to eat certain foods, parentheses, bacon. But God created those foods to be eaten with thanks by faithful people who know the truth. Since everything God created is good, we should not reject any of it, but we should receive it with thanks. For we know it is made acceptable by the word of God and prayer. So even bacon made it into the goodness of God list as foods that we can give thanks for as we are eating and enjoying the taste. We're going to go into a little bit of a history lesson for a moment, and then we're going to come back out of that. So, for some of you, this is probably not your favorite thing, so maybe just buckle the seatbelt, just come along for the ride. But I promise you, I hope it will be enlightening to us in the fact of feasting and what it means throughout the scriptures. So Leviticus 23 reads this way, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, which you are to proclaim as official days for holy assembly. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th is a Sabbath day of complete rest, an official day for holy assembly. It is the Lord's Sabbath day, and it must be observed wherever you live. In addition to the Sabbath, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the official days for holy assembly that are to be celebrated at their proper times each year." And so I'm not going to read through chapter 23, but if you did go through chapter 23, you would see the following feasts or festivals for the Lord's people. We would begin with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And these are the most basic concepts, but the most basic concept of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is, guess what? You eat bread without yeast. You eat unleavened bread. Then we find our way to the Feast of First Fruits, and this is a feast to celebrate the beginning of harvest time. It's to declare trust in God's provision, that we have faith that He will continue to bring forth food from the ground throughout the entire harvest, that He will continue to provide. And then we find a festival of weeks at the end of harvest. So we had the first fruits at the beginning of harvest. We have a festival of weeks at the end of harvest. And here we just celebrate all that God gave during the harvest. Do we see the progression so far? So first fruits, we're celebrating and trusting feasting and expressing belief that God is going to continue to provide. And then in the end of harvest, at the Festival of Weeks, we are celebrating what God, in fact, did provide. And it's eating all around. Right? There's food in all of these. And then we get to the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, I believe I said it correctly, which would be the Jewish New Year. And that's simply celebrating God's faithfulness. And then we find our way to the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tents. So you guys and gals who enjoy tent camping, this would be the feast for you. You would travel to Jerusalem from wherever you find yourself in the Middle East, and you would set up life in a tent with approximately 1 million other people. And you would tent, and you would feast. And tent and feast, it's like halfway my worst nightmare. Like, the feasting sounds cool. Like if they had hotels, right, for the Feast of Tents. If it was the Feast of Hotels, I might be a little bit more apt to be excited about that. But anyways, that's just me. And so what is this remembering, though? The point of this feast is to remember living in tents living in tents, making the way to the promised land. It's for the Israelites to feast and remember their track towards where God was bringing them into the promised land. And it's a celebration. In a weird way, sleeping in tents for a week is a celebration of the home that God has given the Israelites. And there's one more big feast that isn't listed in Leviticus 23, but it's definitely a part of the Old Testament scriptures by and large, and most of us are familiar with this term. It's the Feast of Passover. So the Feast of Passover is the specific feast that comes at the end of the Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Booths. And it celebrates the deliverance from Egypt. It celebrates the freedom from slavery. It celebrates how God brought them out of slavery and brought them into a homeland. And when we think of the word communion, Jesus, when we read in the scriptures, and we're going to in just a moment, we're going to share in communion together. But what we have to understand is that when Jesus is leading us into communion, it's in the context of the Passover feast. In the context of the Passover feast. And so there's some juice and some crackers at your table. So if you could just take a moment while I go grab some for me, if you could grab a cracker, if you could pour a little cup of juice. And we're going to read through the communion passage together. And as we do so, we're going to partake in communion together, but we're also going to look at some of the context in which Jesus and his disciples find themselves. So I'm going to begin reading in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 26. As they were eating, or another way that we could phrase this, as they were feasting for Passover, Jesus took some bread and he blessed it. Or we could think of it in this way: he gave thanks for it. When Jesus blessed the fish and the loaves, he took the bread, he took the fish, he held them up to the sky, and he gave thanks to God for it. And then he broke it, and then he gave it. Jesus took some bread and blessed it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take this and eat, for this is my body." Let's go ahead and eat of the bread together. As we continue on in verse 27, and he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people. It is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many." Let's drink of the cup together. And Jesus says, mark my words. So pay attention. Listen carefully here. I will not drink wine again until the day I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Then they sang a hymn, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. They were feasting together. There was a celebration of the Passover meal, and Jesus says that, pay attention, mark my words, I will not drink or eat of this again until I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So Jesus has promised his disciples and all of his followers that there's going to be a feast in heaven. I can't even imagine the table, right? Like, I hope it's a buffet. That's all I'm saying. I hope it's a big, long buffet. I promise I won't whack anybody with any sort of bows or cut out the knees, I'll wait in line. We'll have time then, but I hope it's a big buffet. I hope the food just magically appears like the Jetsons. Okay, some of you got that. All right, I'm going to refocus. I'm going to refocus here. So this is when we observe communion. We have bread, we have a cup, and they're symbols that point us to Jesus. Bread being a staple of life, of something that we need, and the juice or the wine as being a cup of a covenant. And they're meant to remind us of the realities of Jesus. So bread being a staple, bread was common, so common in the time of Jesus that there's something that we miss when we hear the phrase break bread. And that's this: to break bread and to have a meal essentially mean the same thing. We think of catchphrases that two different ways to describe the same thing: breaking bread, describing breaking bread, or having a meal together. They're catchphrases, in a sense, if you will, that are describing gathering together around a table with other people for a meal. And so this is some of the history of what had happened. Another part of the history I found interesting as I was doing some study is that they never cut bread with a knife. They only broke it. I don't know if anybody else finds that interesting, and we can dive into maybe some of the implications of that, but they broke bread. They never cut bread. Now, when it comes to meat, most of us, I think, probably listed a meat as a favorite type of food. But if we assume that we are all commoners in Jesus' day, meat is very low on the diet list. Very, very low on the food list. Meat was something for the kings, for the wealthy. It wasn't for us common folk. It wasn't for the peasants. And here's why. Because to eat meat, you had to slaughter an animal, not go to McDonald's. Okay? And there were also no tractors. There were no automobiles. There were no trailers. You used animals to complete work on the ground. And so the poor families who only had one ox couldn't afford to kill the ox, because then they would have no way to get the rest of the food that they are harvesting. Does this begin to make sense? And so this is some of the practicality on how meat became really specific to the feasts that we just overviewed in Leviticus 23. That there would be moments where God's people the common people would eat meat, and they would commonly be within a time of feasting before the Lord. And so fish was extremely common, so instead of meat, there was a bounty or plentiful supply of fish, and then, of course, fruits, veggies, nuts. These were the abundant foods. But here's the thing: there was no Walmart, there's no refrigerator, right? So we had to work the ground, or they had to work the ground daily to get their daily bread. It didn't stay good for weeks on end. And this is the context of food in Jesus' time. And here is our unique problem, even today, as we look at the landscape of the world. This is our unique problem as Americans. When every meal becomes an opportunity for a feast, we completely miss the blessing of a feast. When every meal is an opportunity to feast, we completely miss a blessing, the concept of what it means to feast with others and to feast before the Lord. We could say it in a different way that might help to make some sense of it. If feasting is the ordinary, then not feasting becomes the extraordinary. So for us, right, the extraordinary is you willingly don't eat for a period of time called fasting. That's weird. What would be weird if we had little to no food would be feasting every day and eating up all that we had. So we have a unique problem that every meal we have generally is an opportunity for us to feast. And in that problem, we miss the blessing of feasting. And this is where we're going to make our way to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you had bookmarked that in the beginning. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'm going to paraphrase some of what is happening in the scriptures as I work my way through this chapter. And so from the beginning, Paul says here, and he has a transition into chapter 10. It's a continuation of thought, but he says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that had accompanied them. That rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert." Paul begins here by saying, all of these people who were delivered from Egypt, and as they're wandering through the desert, they drank and they ate from the same sustenance that you Christians in Corinth are partaking of. That substance is Christ. But yet, somehow, they still continued to miss the mark, and their bodies were dead, scattered across the desert as they died out. Paul goes on to say that these certain things that happened as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things, such as they did. He says, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and got up to indulge in pagan revelry." The people sat down to feast. They got up to engage in revelry. Connotation is not a positive thing there. And he goes on to list some other examples, and he says, "Be careful that if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Know this, everyone, that there's no temptation that is unique to any one of us. That we're all tempted in the same way, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under that temptation." And this is where it really begins to dive in. This is what I want us to connect with as we close this morning. "Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one loaf." What is Paul beginning to explain here? When we eat of bread, when we drink of the cup, we are participating in worship of Christ. And in Paul's context, this did not mean grape juice and crackers once every 4 or 5 Sundays. It meant meals, eating together, feasting. "Consider the people of Israel," he says. "Do not those who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar?" And he goes on to say in the Corinthian context, you know what? Some people are gathering for meals and they're in the context of temples and pagan gods. And Paul goes on to explain, you know what? they're not God. The meals are to demons, and it's really probably not a beneficial thing. But then they go on, and he begins arguing back and forth. But his point that he wants to make before he even moves forward is this: when we eat of meals together, we are participating in something. When we eat of meals together, when we feast, we are participating in something. Now, what is that something? If we go to verse 23, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. And so here's his practical points. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If some unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go and eat, then eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. So if you go to a non-Christian's house and you're going to have a feast together, you're going to share a meal together, in the back of the Christians' minds, there's a problem in Corinth. And that problem is, did they sacrifice this meat to a demon? Paul says, don't ask. Again, we have to remember, to feast is to participate in something. And Paul says, don't raise questions of conscience. But he goes on to say, but if anyone says to you, hey, this meat has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it. Both for the sake of the person who told you and for conscience sake. And by conscience, I mean the other person's conscience, not yours. And he's saying here, if you go to an unbeliever's house and you're proclaiming worship of Jesus alone, and they said this meat has been offered in sacrifice, in worship to a different God, or as Paul would say, to a demon, if they make that known to you, he says, don't eat it. But he says if they just keep it a secret, don't ask. It's so bizarre what Paul begins to tell us, and then we make our way to verse 31. So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everybody in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. So what does it look like to eat in such a way as to bring glory to God? It means to start with this, with recognizing that when we eat, when we feast together, we are participating in worship of something. We're participating in worship of something. When we feast together, ideally, we are giving thanks to God for what we're eating. We're recognizing his sovereignty, his lordship, and we're giving thanks for his goodness and his gifts and his blessing. But sometimes that may not be the case. Sometimes as we're eating and cramming food in while we're working, we may not be giving thanks to God. We may be doing something else. But there's a dilemma that we find ourselves in because some of us don't even get a lunch hour. So what are we supposed to do? Go without eating? I don't know. That's up to conscience, as Paul would so eloquently leave so much gray area in his writing in chapter 10 of Corinthians. But we have to understand that when we feast together, we are feasting with others and before something. What I'm asking us to consider today is to begin feasting on purpose at moments before the Lord with other people. So, it's been a year when we started the church, we had potlucks or potlucks, I don't know of another word, as a church. And this is one way that our church will practice this, that we'll eat together. This is one way that it works, but this isn't how it works for us in our own lives. I want us to think of one more thing, and then we'll get to the food. I know everybody's hungry, right? You can smell. I don't even know what I smell. I just smell. It smells good. See, I like to feast. Again, I like to feast. God willing, it will be more sanctified in the future. The concept is this, that we can eat with somebody with whom we have absolutely nothing in common. So when we're thinking of representing Jesus to unbelievers, As Paul talked about in the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we can eat with people with whom we have absolutely nothing in common except for one thing. We all need to eat. If there's nothing else that we have in common with anyone else, we can certainly invite them to a meal, because the one thing that we definitely have in common is that we all need to eat. And so one practice that Carly and I have worked at quite some time is trying to invite people that we know who are not following Jesus into our home for a meal. I want to encourage you to begin praying about making that commitment to do so. Because even if there's nothing else, and we've had some weird meals. We've had a meal where there were like 5 words spoken over the course of 2 hours. It was bizarre. I'm not saying that it's always going to go great. We haven't had anyone, stop and commit their life to Jesus in that moment, but I have to believe, as we're sharing what we have in common as humans, as we're participating in a feast together, that we are leading them towards Jesus. Does that begin to make sense? So feasting, Lord, help us to understand what it means to feast before you. Help us to grow in our understanding of what it means that when we're partaking of food, that we're giving thanks for the blessings that you've given to us, for the good gifts that you've given to us, and what it means to be, when we're feasting, to be participating in worship of you. So God, open our minds to this morning, this afternoon. Jesus, we thank you for the food that has been prepared. We acknowledge that everything we have, that every food that comes our way, every bit comes from you, that our sustenance is from you. So God, as we begin to share a meal together and enjoy one another's company, God, may we sense your Spirit with us. May we sense your presence. May we worship you. May we eat and drink, or whatever it is we do, may we do it in such a way that we will bring you glory. Help us to grow in this. Amen.